Hello and welcome to Environmental Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video we're going to be talking about a very influential and important essay within environmental ethics by Aldo Leopold. The name of that essay is The Land Ethic. And we're going to see that Aldo Leopold, who's really a pivotal and important figure within the environmental ethics movement in the United States, ultimately posits that we need to begin the process, or that the process will happen, in which we expand the notion of ethics and ethical obligation and value to include the land. So in many ways, you might say that Aldo Leopold's shift here is a shift towards holism. We looked at that previously when we looked at Holmes Rolston III's essay and his discussion of expanding the notion of value to include not just the value of individual humans, but the value of relationships that exist all the way up the framework in terms of our relationship to the environment and to the other natural entities that exist within the environment. So once again, welcome back. So I love Aldo Leopold. I've published essays on him. So he's one of my favorite philosophers within environmental ethics. And you might even call him or think of him as the father of wildlife management. So he's a pivotal American author, and the essay we're looking at comes from his book, A Sand County Almanac, which was published in the 1940s. And it laid the groundwork for the modern conservation efforts that we've seen within the 20th century and into the 21st century. First within the American context, but ultimately, and from Leopold's perspective, to incorporate the entire world, the entire globe, the biosphere itself. Leopold's innovative perspectives on wildlife management and conservation biology have established him as really, I would say, a seminal figure in the movement of ecological awareness and protection. We should mention, though, he was a conservationist, but he also, in many ways, was a farmer. Or he wasn't a farmer, that wasn't his job, but he recognized the importance of farming and conservation work throughout his career. So what are some of the key principles we're going to look at in this essay? Well, first is the notion of that there is indeed, of course, an ethical relationship with nature. This shouldn't be surprising given the fact that we're discussing and reading his work here in our environmental ethics course. But in the Sand County Almanac, and in particular this essay, The Land Ethic, he asserts the importance of an ethical relationship between humans and the natural world. One of the key terms he's going to discuss is the notion that human beings are citizens within a larger ecological and a biotic community. He actually refers to us, human beings, as being biotic citizens. And this is an important part because clearly on the one hand, we can talk about the way in which human beings are the ones who develop the notion of ethics and think about ethics and morality and so forth. But he wants to encourage us to see that individuals, we need to view the land not merely as property, not merely as something for us to use as a resource, but really to see the land and our particular local environment as a community of natural entities and relationships that belong to the community in order to eventually foster a better sense of respect and care for all of the living entities that exist within the ecosystem. Now, Leopold's land ethic, of course, promotes the intrinsic value not just of animals, but the intrinsic value of the ecosystem itself and the ecosystem's components. And so you can think of him again under the purview of what we've discussed previously as a form of environmental or ethical or moral holism. And this means that we're talking about the intrinsic value of soil, water, plants, and animals. And also, I think he would add here the atmosphere as well. And his view and his philosophy is going to stress that all of the components of the ecosystem have a right to exist and ultimately also a right to thrive. And we're citizens along with the other citizens of our biotic community. And this means that we need to encourage much more sustainable practices within our own use of the land that helps to enhance ecological integrity. Now, sustainable land use practices is a major thought within this. And you can think of Leopold as an important conservationist. But the idea here isn't just to not conserve, but to conserve the land simply so we can keep using it, but to recognize its importance for our own as well as its own ecological health. And this means that sustainable land use practices have to move beyond just thinking about mere economic and capitalistic gain. He's going to urge, and he does urge, individuals and communities to adopt practices that actually nurture and protect the environment, shifting a focus from just short-term benefits to a greater long-term thinking, where we're concerned about sustainability. And one of the things that's different about Aldo Leopold is Leopold has access to to much more modern concept. Well, I shouldn't say just Leopold, but Leopold, from his standpoint in history, is aware of ecology in a much deeper sense, scientifically, than many of his forebears. So he actually begins his essay by actually quoting from the Odyssey. And he talks about the idea that the Odyssey represents to us a very old school way of thinking that today we would never agree with. He begins by thinking about ancient Greece. And he talks about the notion that in the Odyssey, this is a Greek epic written by Homer, or at least credited to Homer, that goes back, thousands of years. And the Odyssey actually exemplified the ethical limitations of its own time when it discusses the notion that people are just slaves and slaves are just property. He talks about the idea that when Odysseus returns home, Odysseus, one of the first things he does is he hangs a bunch of slaves. Now, to us, today in the modern world, in the 21st century, we recognize the ethical problems of slavery, but they weren't recognized in Homer's time. Now, the reason that Leopold begins with this in his essay is to help us recognize that ethics is in a state of evolution, and that we normally like to think about ethics as being frozen in time, probably because we want to make sure that our own moral views are objectively the right moral views and so on and so forth. But if we look historically, and we reach back all the way to the Odyssey, we see that, for instance, treating slaves as just property and executing them when you want to was considered morally justified. So you can think about other philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche as an example. Of course, Nietzsche's not talking about the environment, and Nietzsche is, I think, probably much more deep philosophical thinker, whereas Leopold is a much deeper environmental thinker, and probably certainly not as profound maybe as Nietzsche. But Nietzsche and Leopold both recognize that ethics is in a state of evolution. Now, unlike Nietzsche, and we can put Nietzsche to the side now, his view is that what's happening over time historically is that our sense of what is our sense of ethical obligations in terms of who demands our attention ethically has actually evolved over time to expand more and more people. And this means that in this ancient Greek view, morality was much more restricted. And expediency was recognized over maybe ethical duty or something like that, expedience to one's own self. But Leopold begins this passage from the Odyssey in order for us to recognize that ethics, factually speaking, has actually expanded and is evolving over time. By the time you get to the 19th century, for instance, philosophers we've already seen have already begun to advocate for a much broader set of ethical considerations. And I would say even before the 19th century, I just picked this date as one because it relates to what we've looked at in terms of Henry David Thoreau. But if we go back even further, even to the Middle Ages, we see an expansion of ethical obligations. And this means that we see a pushing for the recognition of societal obligations and the welfare of communities that are not just about personal relationships. So we see a movement from the individual to widen up to include other individuals, to include the notion of the community, and so on and so forth. And we'll see that Leopold's view and his approach is to say that this movement in the evolution of ethics will eventually and should necessarily include the land itself, not just animals, but the land as a whole. So by the time we get to modern day, contemporary period, contemporary ethics now recognizes that there is something important about thinking about our environmental responsibilities. And we've talked a lot about the intrinsic value of other natural entities, in particular ecosystems, if you think about Rolston, for instance. And in the contemporary period, we're now advocating for a much more sustainable relationship between humans and nature. And we haven't yet defined sustainability, but let's just say this, is that sustainability means that it's possible to continue to have ethical obligations to various life forms and systems of life that exist within the environment. So first and foremost, when you're reading through Aldo Leopold's work, recognize that from the very get-go, the backdrop of his entire essay is the recognition that ethics and our moral philosophy is in a state of historical evolution. So the question is, where do we go from here? Well, on the one hand, we've talked a lot about individual relationships. This is probably the foundations of ethics, where the first stage of what Leopold calls the ethical sequence focuses on individuals, but that as evolution evolves, individual relations, or rather our obligations, evolve not just simply towards individuals, but ultimately towards social and societal obligations. We can think here about the importance, not in terms of individuals here, but in terms of the importance of the community. So we see a movement from individuals to the community, and Leopold's view is this now needs to expand to the environment as a whole, where our ethical considerations expand to encompass all of societal obligations, and those include, of course, the nature itself and the natural environment. So again, think of yourself as not just an individual living in the world where you're going around making decisions which are good for yourself. This is the opposite of egoism. Instead of egoism, just thinking about your own self-interest, we see here that the community itself and the environment as a whole demands our ethical and our moral attention, which means we need to integrate ecological considerations into our ethical framework. And this brings us to the notion of the community concept. For Leopold, the community concept is a central idea that emphasizes the interdependency that we have in nature, that really all of us have, human beings, animals, insects, the soil, etc. So the community concept at the heart of the land ethic asserts that humans are integral members of an interconnected ecosystem, which includes the soil, water, plants, rivers, animals, the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. And Aldo Leopold emphasizes the importance that we recognize that these relationships exist, and we recognize their intrinsic value, and we recognize that we have an obligation to protect elements of that environment and of that system, or if you will, of our community. The name of this community he calls the land. So when he talks about the land, normally we think of the land as just dirt out there, the stuff, a place for us to do things. But here we have to recognize that the land is more than just that. It actually represents the community upon which our own lives depend and upon which we are interacting members, and we make a difference too. Which means that we have to, if we're going to talk about the expansion of ethics, we're talking about working towards fostering a cooperation and a respect among these living entities. So the next sort of way we think about it is that the land ethic, therefore, if we're to evolve this land ethic, that means that we have to develop an ecological conscience. And we can talk about conservationism, for instance. And Leopold talks about the idea that there have been many examples of superficial conservation measures. Conservation is the notion of conserving the land, and there's maybe two senses of it. We'll talk about this when we get to the work of Arne Ness, where we talk about the difference between shallow and deep ecology. But conservation has been fairly shallow up to this point, and maybe I would argue it still is today, where conservation is really about preserving the land so we can continue to use it as a resource. But this is superficial, and in fact, Leopold will actually talks about the way in which conservation measures tend to overly rely upon superficial approaches that ultimately fail to instill a genuine ethical commitment to land stewardship. One of the things that Leopold discusses in the essay is a conservation measure in which the soil was being eroded and destroyed over time. Think about the Dust Bowl. And that people in Wisconsin realized this, and so they actually passed laws to help give people the education that they needed so that farmers could themselves write the rules for how conservation should exist. Because farmers, like anyone else, don't want the government telling them how to do their work or how to live their lives. But here's the problem, is that when Wisconsin passed these measures, and they said, listen, we realize this, so what we'll do is we'll let all of the farmers write the rules for conservation that everyone has to agree to, and then we'll fund all the supplies and we'll make sure it actually takes place. But Leopold notes that despite all of those efforts, nothing ever happened. So education alone and simply giving people a sort of superficial means to conserve the land for their own economic resources never worked. And it still doesn't work today. In fact, today in the United States of America, we're seeing today a lot of the same practices that once existed, which are actually depleting the soil of its capacity to grow crops. And so we're seeing the destruction of soil over time, despite all of the work for conservation and sustainability that we've seen throughout all of these different years since Leopold. What's missing is this land ethic component. Now, what's at the core of the problem here? Leopold's view is that we have an economic view of the land rather than an ethical view, which means that we value the environment and we value the land simply because it's able to create economic benefits for us. But we don't really recognize, at least in a sort of factual sense, is that there is an intrinsic value to these ecosystems. And what this reveals is there really is a lack of a true ecological conscience. Now, Leopold is trying to diagnose the problem. And so his view is that whenever we have an economic consideration over an ethical one, we tend to always choose the economic. And this is the problem. What we need to do in his view, and by the way, he is positive, and I think, at least that's how I read him, and I think that he's hopeful, is that eventually the land ethic and a broader sense of our ethical and moral awareness regarding the land will actually take place. But the big stumbling block here is economics. Now, within his essay, he points out again and again that education is not simply enough. Just telling people and teaching people about the way in which the environment works isn't enough, because what's needed is ultimately a completely new way of recognizing values that exist with the environment. We have to begin to recognize ourselves as biotic citizens within the larger community itself. This is the community concept. We have to learn to recognize the interconnectedness of all life forms and all natural forms that are required for life. So a true ecological conscience requires a much deeper understanding regarding the commitment that we have to this interconnectedness to all life forms. And this, if we're able to eventually get there in terms of the land ethic, this would help us enable and advocate for a shift from simply looking at the land as purely an economic resource towards looking at it as a part of our community itself. Think about the idea that your own personal community. So each of us has a community. We each have friends, and we have a social. Maybe you have a church group, you have a college group, whatever it is. Even our civic organizations. All of these are organizations that recognize that we have ethical obligations with each other. We are moving, Leopold argues, in a direction, and we need to move even faster to recognizing that has to include even the land itself. So, what are some of the substitutes for that land ethic? This is sort of what digging into the economical versus the ethical perspectives. Well, in the early 20th century, as I mentioned before, conservation efforts largely focused on economic motivations. So the idea was convince the farmers to do better for their land because it's better for their pocketbook. But this ultimately sidelines species without direct economic value, such as wildflowers and songbirds or butterflies. These sorts of creatures don't really figure into the economic system, even though we know ecologically they do function a central and a pivotal part within our overall natural environment. Think of bees, for instance. Today, bees all over the world, we're seeing um, um, beehives collapse. And this is going to create a major problem, not just for us and our ability to grow crops, but for the environment as a whole, and really thousands and tens of thousands of species. So every animal species and all parts of the environment function together. And in the early 20th century, this wasn't recognized. Now, present day conservation policies still today favor economically valuable species. And so I would say today, the land ethic that Aldo Leopold's writing about still hasn't fully come to fruition. But I think we're making headway. We're making motion in the right direction. But when you consider the potential catastrophe that, for instance, anthropogenic or human created climate change is causing around the world, we're not moving fast enough. Let's just put it that way. And that we need to move away from neglecting these integral roles that have a non-economic value, but recognizing them as central and essential, and more importantly, that we have an obligation to protect them within the ecosystem. So where's the future headed? Well, you can be dour and cynical, or you can take Leopold's approach, is that a shift is needed towards a land ethic. And Leopold argues, if you think about his historical analysis, that ethics will indeed get there. But it needs to happen quicker. And this is kind of why he's writing the essay. We need to get to the spot where we actually, in an everyday sense, recognize the instrumental value of all species. And we need to promote a much more inclusive and a balanced approach to conservation. Again, conservation shouldn't be just predicated on the idea of conserving it for an economic resource. In other words, if you cut all the trees, make sure you plant more so you can keep the logging industry going. That's precisely the wrong approach. We need to move in an approach where conservation is organized and understood according to the values we actually hold. And we hold these values according to the community, the ecological community of which we are part. So we need to be careful not to just look at, for instance, movements towards sustainability as being a substitute for the land ethic. At the end of the day, it has to be much wider than that. The ethical sequence must evolve. So one of the things, and this is one of the things I love about Leopold's essay, is he kind of gets into some of the ecology. And he talks about the notion of the way in which energy flows through the land. Of course, energy begins from the sun and it comes down into the soil and the plants. And the plants grow. And as the plants die and regenerate, the soil becomes rich with nutrients and nitrogen and a number of other elements. And that then the insects live on those. And then the plants live off those. And then inevitably the human beings live off of these. And that this energy flow from soil to apex predator is ultimately let's put it this way, it is an illustration, it is the structure of the community of which we're actually a part. So the land ethic represents the structure of the ecosystem, and it showcases how energy flows from the soil through various layers of life, such that at the base, soil provides these essential nutrients, and there's a hierarchical system where each layer plays a critical role in the overall health and stability of the system. And of course, don't forget, human beings are also a part of that. We ourselves are members of this community, and we have an effect. But we live off it, but we also affect it as well. So we have to recognize that there's an interdependency, and that ultimately ecological balance is the key. We have to understand that the land pyramid, and he actually draws this diagram between the soil all the way to the predators to human beings, the land pyramid is crucial for recognizing this type of interdependency. So disruptions at any level, whether they occur from human beings or at the base level and so on and so forth, all of these ultimately have an effect. And they can include such things as the removal of species, habitat degradation, and all of these can have cascading effects throughout the food chain. I encourage you to take a look at the science of ecology, which is actually dedicated to trying to articulate and understand these systems of interdependency. And so if we're going to talk about our moral obligation, we can talk about obligations to individual species and so forth. But we have to recognize that we have an obligation to the whole, to the entirety of the ecosystem. And we can use this notion of the land pyramid to help us recognize the various levels of that obligation. So that means that when we take a look at today, we take a look at the environment, it's clear that there is a necessity for the land ethic, right? To cultivate a true land ethic, though, individuals have to foster a love, a respect, almost as it were a spiritual approach and admiration for the land, to see its value not just in terms of economic terms, but as integral to the health of our ecological communities. Now, in the essay, Leopold emphasizes that simply educating people about how to treat the land and how to create more healthy soil, for instance, is not enough. Ultimately, you have to change, as it were, the hearts and the minds of ourselves, of the people. And this shift towards the land ethic is essential because it will change and enhance our perspective to recognize the connection that all of us, animals, and all plants, etc., all of us are a part of this larger community, which means this underscores the way in which human beings really need to be responsible in terms of their interactions with the environment, in terms of stewardship. So what's the conclusion? What do we take away from some of these broad gestures that Leopold recognizes and discusses within the land ethic? Well, one, we need to think about redefining our land relationships. Think right now you're watching this video, which means you're on Earth, because we don't have, unless you're watching it on the International Space Station, you're on Earth, you're on the land. And how do you view the land? You need to think about the ways in which you can shift your perspective towards thinking of the land as essential, not just a place where you can use the land for your own purposes, but thinking of yourself as a part of this community of interdependent parts that require respect and care. Now, one of the challenges I think that we have to realize with the land ethic is that many, many people today live in urban environments. In a dense urban environment, it's very easy to forget that there is a larger ecological environment that exists. I used to live in New York City for many years, and in New York City, for instance, I never had a problem with mosquitoes, though I'm sure someone from New York will watch this and tell me otherwise. But when I lived there, I never had any problem. I lived in Brooklyn, and there was never really any mosquitoes to deal with. Well, now I live in a place where there are lots of mosquitoes. So, for instance, if you live in a dense urban environment, it becomes difficult to recognize and therefore to then redefine your relationship with the land. But Leopold's point is that this is a necessity and we need to think about it. So even if you're in an urban environment, I encourage you to look up into the sky and see the sky. The sky is natural. The clouds are wild, and so are the birds which fly. And recognize that you are a member within this larger community. And this means that additionally, we need to embrace ethical as well as aesthetic values that allow us to appreciate the intrinsic worth of nature. This fosters a deeper connection. But one of the things that Leopold discusses is it's not just, the land ethic isn't just ethical. It's not just purely in terms of our moral obligations of what I have to do, what my rules for my life are, but it's also in terms of our recognition of beauty. So beauty is an essential category within Leopold's work that we shouldn't forget. And that ultimately, when we are able to move and foster this deeper connection, this deeper aesthetic sense of value, and this deeper ecological sense of value, we can actually begin to cultivate a love for the land, where a true land ethic calls for love and respect for admiration for the land, which are vital for preserving ecological integrity and ensuring sustainability. Today, we are witnessing one of the great die-offs, and a great extinction is taking place. Biologists estimate that within the next 30 to 50 years, roughly 50% of the species that live on Earth will go extinct. And take a look at E.O. Wilson's work in his book, I believe, One World, which he discusses this. but E.O. Wilson talks about this. We don't have much time left. Literally, right now, habitats are being destroyed all over the world. The atmosphere is being polluted. The atmosphere is warming, and species are dying all over the world, which means that the biotic community is eroding. And this is happening faster and faster at, as it were, a exponential rate, which means that it's high time that we act immediately. But again, Leopold's point is we're not going to really be able to make that movement until we can change our perspective itself, until we can change our view that the environment is just a resource to use. And we have to move away from just thinking that education will solve it. Many people talk about this. I loved the work on climate change that, for instance, former Vice President Al Gore has done. But Al Gore emphasizes the notion of education. But notice, it's been almost 20 years since Al Gore, or maybe even longer since Al Gore was talking about this. It's been decades, 40 years since the 1980s that, for instance, climate change was recognized as a real phenomena, and yet we've done hardly anything. And again, I hear people saying education is the key. Education doesn't change things if we continue to have a merely economic concern for the land. So we have to move away, and this is the hard part, and I'll be honest, I don't think Aldo Leopold, he talks about the importance of land ethic, he talks about the notion that this is where we're headed, but how we get there is still yet to be seen. We still are not sure how to cultivate the land ethic. But that's why you're watching this video, and I'm hoping that even though this is educational, that you'll recognize that we have to begin to foster a sense of value for the larger landed community, but we need to do it in a way where we're teaching children, I think, as they grow, to have these values, and not just to recognize that everything has just a price tag. That ultimately the land, the environment, farmers are important and so forth, but the land has a value outside of all of these things, and we have to move in this direction. With that said, I'll end my brief summary and introduction to the land ethic. Read the essay. I think you will be moved by it. It's a beautiful essay, and there's lots to take a look at and lots to think about here. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Environmental Ethics, and I'll see you online.